They are vampires, but not as you know it. It isn't by accident we think of a blood-sucking Dracula or Nosferatu, or more modern renditions like Blade or Twilight when the word vampire is mentioned. They can only prowl at night, well, apart from the daywalker concept in Blade, of course, an aversion to garlic, holy water, etc. The origin of a vampire-type entity seems to go all the way back to an ancient Egyptian god called Sekhmet. Having such an extreme lust for blood, after almost wiping out all of humanity, she was then tricked by Ra using blood-coloured alcohol to lure her in. After getting drunk, she stood down and peacefully left humans alone. How that one hasn't been made into a movie, I don't know, but seems to qualify as a vampire by the original standard. But what if a vampire is a good description for them? Only they steal and drain your energy instead of blood, and in some cases may actually have a requirement for blood, talked about more in my article, More Like Us Than We Would Like. I used to refer to people as social vampires when coming home from being out during my sociable years, and rather than feeling energised and like you had had a good time, it was the opposite. And after narrowing it down, realised it was certain people who would contribute to that feeling, and others that did the opposite. But on a bigger scale, if you realise your energy is being taken from you by people using various methods, two things should be considered. 1. Where does the energy go and what for? 2. Who or what needs it? Another thing that started to make me think of the real concept of vampire is the incessant need for people to volunteer for things that appear to give away your freedom or soul. You must consent. You must be a volunteer, rather than a victim. They need you to invite them in. I'm not sure why, but it seems to be a theme that you have to sell your soul willingly. It can't just be taken. Is that why we have a saying, selling your soul? Because it does indeed represent something quite real and tangible. Perhaps. So much that was once foolish to consider now seems almost perilous not to. There is so much at stake here, no pun intended, we can't afford to not cover all bases, and maybe their new digital ID travel method they would like to roll out, which requires a drop of your blood for screening, has other purposes. As if they are looking for something, and testing the DNA of everyone hasn't yielded the results they were after, so they have to find another way to monitor and find what they want. That shall remain to be seen. I will continue to think through what may seem ridiculous and far-fetched, pulling together ideas, plot lines and theories and putting them out there. But it should be clear to many that we are in danger, individually and as a group, and should have our wits about us and senses on alert. Who knows what is really going on and coming up, but it can't hurt to consider it all. More like us than we would like. Vampires, but this time a bit more as you know them. Literature and films have done much to make us aware of them, what they are, and how they are apparently above us in the food chain, and what their habits and weaknesses are. My previous article, They Are Vampires But Not As You Know It, speculated on them being energy harvesters rather than the old-fashioned portrayal. But that is where it begins, with the old-fashioned view. Dracula. The book, as I haven't seen the film, but the same premise I believe. An ancient blood-drinking evil in the form of a human, mingling amongst its food and being hunted when its true nature is revealed. There are also many stories and legends around Europe and vampires and blood-drinking demons, with the above being centred around Transylvania in Romania. The Lost Boys. A modern take on them, bringing them into now and making them cool and trendy. Blade. Another one with ultra-modern overtone with trendy clothes, music, fast-paced and violent. Definitely catering to a market, and slightly different maybe as that one came from the comic book world. Near Dark. An interesting backroad vampire story of how they can just drift along through society, not really standing out as long as you blend in. From Dusk Till Dawn. Not what I was expecting at all as a film, but gave more of a demonic, inhuman makeup to the vampire that other movies hadn't really, the exterior flesh reflecting the monster within once exposed. Interview with the Vampire. A good representation of how an immortal could slip through the ages, changing with the times and showing only what was needed to get by, then being the only one to go into the future, knowing others are long since dead. Twilight. Haven't seen it, but the way it was talked about and fawned over online made me think it was just another new trendy version for the next generation. And really, isn't that the fountain of youth? The key to being immortal? They always say that whoever found the fountain of youth would quite probably keep it to themselves, not wanting to share that kind of power. But what if that fountain also needed to be maintained, with a steady stream of young blood? You wouldn't want everyone knowing about it, because you would face problems on a few points. Firstly, you wouldn't be able to decide who will be there with you when everyone else is gone. And secondly, you wouldn't want too many immortals, otherwise there may not be enough to feed the fountain, which places us as their food source. Suddenly sounds very similar to rituals we are told were performed in certain ancient civilizations: bloodletting, bathing in blood, sacrifices and mass graves, the killing of their own apparently, which may well have happened, as they say, just as appeasement to God or whatever they believed it was for. But what if those graves were the leftovers and rubbish, just as we say when we find old pits from previous times? How would you know years later if they had been drained of blood? If it is an elixir though, then adrenochrome makes much more sense, and why it's taken from the young by the old. They might not just look old if they are rejuvenating themselves, saying it's surgery or just disappearing from public view if it starts to become obvious. Remember that film, Death Becomes Her, with the potion? Well, they never really specify what it is or where it comes from. How we use blood within society, from a medical perspective, could easily have another world harvesting and controlling certain blood for another purpose running alongside it, might almost go unnoticed. There have been many things revealed lately about the true horrors that we live around, not safely tucked away in films you can just switch off, or a book you can put down and walk away from, even if they do give us hints at what really is there. But existing alongside us nonetheless, where we just can't turn it off or walk away. Many things have taken a rather demonic turn, so I don't think it's unreasonable to give some thought as to why that is. In the old underground. I've already done a piece about some strange things underground, and of there being a grisly past time, and of dark things that have occurred in One Thing Leads to Another. But I gave more thought to what might be down there, and of mysteries and ideas surrounding the levels of our Earth, and what might dwell in the deep. There are a few examples of things being discovered with legends attached to them, or just no explanation at all. The Well to Hell in Russia. It may not be as the legend says, as a good story popped up around it after 1989, but a drilled hole of 12 kilometres deep found some geological abnormalities. Although what they were is not stated, the story was that recording equipment was lowered down and screams from hell could be heard. But upon scrutiny it seems it was a looped tape of recordings to make it sound as such. Mel's Hole, Washington. Another legend from our time as it popped up in 1997, with very little to back it up other than the story of a deep hole which could bring back the dead, specifically the dog of a neighbour who had passed that they threw into the hole apparently, then seeing it alive later, of cover-ups and witnesses who can't quite remember where it is but that it holds supernatural powers. Two films spring to mind for this which incidentally came out in the 80s, Pet Sematary and The Gate. So it seems likely it was just a good earner for someone briefly who wanted to perhaps sell a book. Who can say for sure? Huska Castle, Czech Republic. This one is a bit weirder and seems to sort of be accepted as this is what it is. So I'll just paste the whole bit from Wikipedia as it says it all. And most specifically the chapel was constructed over a large hole in the ground that is a gateway to hell, which is allegedly so deep that no one could see the bottom of it. Animal-human hybrids were reported to have crawled out of it, and dark-winged, otherworldly creatures flew in its vicinity. Legend has it that when construction began in the castle, all of the prisoners that were sentenced to death were offered a pardon if they consented to be lowered by rope into the hole and report back on what they saw. When the first person was lowered, he began screaming after a few seconds and when pulled back to the surface, he looked as if he had aged 30 years. He had grown wrinkles and his hair had turned white. They say it was used by Nazis during World War II for experiments in the occult using the powers of hell. But the stories go back much further, as it is said that the castle is built where it is in the 13th century. The pit in the lower levels of the castle is said to be a gateway to hell. Thus, by constructing the Gothic building's defensive walls facing inward, they were able to keep the demons trapped in the lower levels' thickest walls closest to the whole of the castle. I mean, they all pretty much sound like urban legends and myths, created or updated to fit the time they find themselves in. And strangely, although we move towards a tech rev, it seems to have a rather medieval undertone to it, which then makes me think of our other random myths, movies, monsters, and ideas that seem to remain in our psyche and collective histories. But of the above examples, the one that made me think further was the person being aged 30 years somewhat instantly. A terrifying concept, and if you applied that to Alice in Wonderland, would have been a different story entirely. Gone for an hour topside, but actually it was 30 years once you fell down the hole, and you experienced all those years, and grew, and came to a world that you no longer knew. Another film comes to mind here, Flight of the Navigator, 1986, where a kid is missing for what he thinks is an hour or two, but turns out it's been 8 years and he hasn't aged a day. It's a great film, but feels really sad mostly, and gives a strange view on how confusing something like that could be. We always portray in movies and books that there are crypts underground for old creatures, hiding in the bowels of the earth, that come topside to feed and rejuvenate. Vampires and other things of a humanoid nature, but not part of nature as we have been taught. Time rings. The closer you get to the spinning core, time speeds up. There is a theory that the time dilation occurs when you are either closer or further away from the spinning undertones of our realm. So with that in mind, it could easily be that there is a hole going down to the earth that gets closer to that, aging a person as they get closer, but without it being a reverse mechanism, only a one-way ticket to the end. But if you started down there and could make yourself younger by coming up, well, that would be a different story. Yet tales of things that dwell down there remain, as do remnants of old cities, tunnels and secrets long buried or hidden from everyday view. So many possibly don't even give thought to what is underfoot, not even realising the history they are stepping over or on, or what perhaps is going on underfoot. We hear more talk these days of modern tunnels and hidden systems operating beneath the surface, of a world you don't see happening within the world you do. Hidden in plain sight, as you might say. And it might be the same for other things. Darker and more sinister things that you thought were long since dead or forgotten, but that are still there. You just can't quite see them. In the dark. I guess many people feel like we are in the dark about lots of things, collectively and maybe personally in your own circle. Funnily enough, the Dark Ages, being a whole period of time they just sort of forget or brush off, just erasing it from history without having to actually destroy anything. Just change the dates a bit, play dumb and ignore any real evidence. And as we have seen, institutions are very good at that. But this one is about an idea. One of those out there ones, with a movie storyline parallel raising its head again. My article, Prep for Disaster or Clever Programming, touched on different films being used to prime people for triggers and responses. And sometimes there are threads of truth running through them. And because it doesn't play out in the same way, or with the same horrors of the film, it gets dismissed. I Am Legend. This is the focus since the new cancer jab came into the public forum. And today it was noted of the similarities between the outfit of Dr. Crippen in the film when giving an interview about the breakthrough for humanity, and the doctor who did the TV interview the other day. The whole setup was rather eerie, so I do agree with the talk on the street there. But the film, if you don't know, sees a catastrophic end-of-time side effect to their cure, and it turns people into awful, monstrous creatures that could only go out at night. So take away the horror elements of monsters, and look at the mechanism, I wondered if perhaps the real version has found a way to make people allergic to the sun or to vitamin D, to make the body recognise it as a toxin, to attack the skin, causing it to burn or react, as it has with other components of tinkering with our system. May sound silly to some people, but I'm considering all ideas these days, taking away the layers of added horror or imagination that have been added for entertainment, to strip it back to what it might have started as, with a very real purpose and outcome expected, distracting people from that with the idea of supernatural and horrifying hellish creations to try and kill you. And it makes me then think of my article, In the Old Underground, and of other creatures known to fear the sun, namely vampires. I have already spent much time wondering on that particular subject, and considered it an option, but not in the way the movies portray, although as we have talk of adrenochrome these days, are the ideas of vampires really so far off? Strange though, that when you see the apparent drug-addled zombies in America, I couldn't help thinking it was like The Walking Dead, but without them actually being zombies or dead. So, figured in this instalment to come with the next round of the Pied Piper trying to play the same tune, some of the symptoms would mimic that of vampires, hoping perhaps to whip people into a frenzy over it. And to be fair, if you thought you could set on fire just from going into the sun, it might change how you think, live and act, and how others view you. Perhaps, given what we have seen in the past few years, I wouldn't put anything past them, as they try to cover the sun, make a fake one, or create issues around us being able to have access to the very necessary light needed. It would seem their style and the sneaky way to do it. Rather than take the sun away, just take away our ability to be in it. Seeing red. A dark theme appears to be running, and seemed somewhat hidden until recently, or not so hidden once you connect the dots that are available. And we do have a saying in society, for behaviour of an angry nature, where we might say someone sees red before they lose it. But this is not for that. This is for a more sinister setup altogether, like a rather dark enterprise perhaps touched upon, but a darker sequel to it. It is said there are dark clubs, projects and secret societies that harvest children, for awful purposes generally, but one that has made it into the mainstream in the last few years features red, as clothing, shoes, accessories and other things, it being said that it's human skin being used for those products as the raw material. And when they make a big deal of red, it's a sign and a marker. I've also noted how red ties together vampires, Santa and his anagram namesake, Satan, a bright colour used to lure, and a calling card, one that represents blood and is portrayed with poppies. There have been a number of examples of companies and prominent people being embroiled in scandals, none of which see an end to it, or an overall exposure. More a desensitisation of people, and a slow meander to make it all more mainstream. And many will not be able to, or will want to really comprehend the horrors being discussed, which is probably what is expected of many, not just to turn a blind eye, but to blind the mind to its atrocity altogether. And we are in a time when corruption and horrors are being revealed on a scale not seen before, so I can understand why people might be struggling to either keep up or to properly assimilate what they are seeing in the media or firsthand, and the feeling and thoughts that follow, or not for some people. Many people were switched off and dissociated before 2020 threw us into a new time, a time of needing to be more on your guard than ever before, and to try and see what's behind the bright colours and lies. It's going to be important. A trail of blood. There have been a couple of articles already speculating on the vampire legends and myths. They are vampires, but not as you know it, and more like us than we would like. As well, in the old underground, for a glance at what appears to be evidence of rituals, altars, and so many bones, it begs the question of what exactly was occurring for that to be normal. And sometimes I wonder if time's passed based on what appears to be left behind, that there is always something extra creepy and dark that runs underneath. Literally. In tunnels and caves deep underground and hidden from view, and from sunlight. Because behind the scripts, storylines and myths, I can't help thinking that, as with much, there is a thread of truth running through it, being distorted and watered down by fantastical elements and sensationalism. Or not. Maybe they are just throwing it out there in all its ugly reality, but we choose not to believe it, finding it easier to deny its existence, because that would mean you have to face it, and ideally, deal with it. Maybe as others have had to before, who also get a mention in fictional settings, Van Helsing being the most famous in that category, leaving a trail of blood rather than breadcrumbs to reveal that dark thread that would prefer to stay in the shadows or just behind the scenes. Blood banks. They could just be for what they say they are, to help people who are in need after an accident or medical incident, or that could be a cover for the actual purpose, like a convenience store in every city for those who need it to survive, without bringing too much attention to yourself by just taking it off the street, as it were. And there is much speculation about us being a food source, that we are farmed and kept as we are like animals for purpose. We can't deny that there is a devious and dark thread that runs through what we know as humans. But is there something else alongside that, taking advantage of that dark cover to hide in plain sight, and even darker reality? Also, they are usually stocked with blood from people who have donated, as far as I know. Another twist on the vampire needing to be invited. You need to be a volunteer, it seems. Covered as well in That's the Ticket. Blood types. I sometimes wonder if it is the blood type that reveals more than we know, that it can give away the ones who would be considered prime stock, and then graded thereafter. It might also reveal a crossover where there are hybrids, like the humans and angels idea, which then created the Nephilim, they say. What if we have other half-breeds and hybrids among us that we don't recognise? Not like us might be relevant there. Death Becomes Her, 1992. A film that portrayed a potion, a price, and immortality, made into a colourful and entertaining movie, showing how people will trade much for fame and beauty, but without always thinking through the consequences, and often being taken by ego, lust, and jealousy along the way, making you wonder if some people who appeared to go before their time were made to step back from view, as in the film, or they weren't playing the game they had signed up for. Who knows? Adrenochrome. Something that appears very much linked to the overall idea of a vampire, that certain blood is more vibrant than others, and gives them that fountain of youth that pops up here and there in myth and folklore too. And if that were so, and an ancient race of blood-drinking humans did coexist with us, wouldn't it be prudent for them to look after their food source, as well as herd them towards what is needed? Encourage a steady supply of blood deposits for those banks, a steady supply of offspring to feed on, and be the next generation of blood donors and breeders. And it may seem weird that they would reveal what they are, and their methods along the way, but to me it does two things. People will naturally decide mostly that it is really too far-fetched to be real, imagining the classic vampire, sleeping in a coffin, living in a castle, scared of sunlight and garlic, and crosses and hallowed ground being their nemesis. Funny, isn't it, that in churchyards they also use coffins to bury people, and have crypts underneath them. Maybe they are happier being within what we have called hallowed ground after all. But if a person did happen to meet one, or find themselves in the grips of that setup, then it would also be easier to adjust to it being real perhaps, as you have a reference point and something behind it. Or maybe they have just tried to hide and stay out of the way, and it is others who, like Van Helsing, take on the role of exposing it and making sure people don't forget. Our memories can be short, and if we are on a shorter clock than they are, I can see why we might need to be reminded.